I served 2 tours in Vietnam. The first tour was in Capital Military Assistance Command, which was in Saigon. And the second tour I served was with the 7th of the 1st Air Cav down in the Delta in Vien Long. On the first tour, I have a funny story. I had spent 3 years in the military, and I got out of the service and I went home, and it was in the middle of the winter and it was cold and I didn't really like it. So I re-enlisted, and I re-enlisted for Vietnam. And the recruiter was saying that he thought that was pretty funny because people were going to Canada to get away from the draft, and here I was re-enlisting and I was going to Vietnam. So he said, I'm going to get you a really good assignment. He said, I'm going to get you a MACV assignment, which was Military Advisory Command in Saigon. And so he got me that assignment. I had served 18 months in Korea, and when I got the assignment for Vietnam, the reenlistment for Vietnam, I had to take jungle training because I had not had it. And so I took my jungle training at Fort Lewis, Washington. And that was like at the end of January, the end of January, first part of February. While I was going through the training, it was a 5-day exercise. It was snowing. And so I was attacking these mock villages and everything as a company. And General Westmoreland had just left his command in Vietnam and was on his way back to be chief of staff in Washington, D.C. And he had stopped in. So as I completed this training and we come out of this one hut, there's General Westmoreland with his staff and everybody and the commander of Fort Lewis and everything. So he comes up to me and says, well, soldier, what'd you think of this training? And I said, well, I thought it was kind of funny. And he said, what do you mean funny? In 5 days you're going to be in Vietnam and you're not going to think it's funny? And I said, no, sir. It's snowing, and I realized that in Vietnam it's going to be about 110 degrees. And he looked around and he looked at the snow and he said, yeah, it is kind of funny, isn't it? He said, and then he walked off. But that was the first start, and you think about it, and get to meet General Westmoreland. He was a very nice gentleman. Well, I got to Saigon, and we flew in about 3 o'clock in the morning, and on a United flight. And when they came in, they said they were going to shut the lights off and close the windows because they didn't want mortar attacks or anything. And that was kind of scary because as the plane lands and you look out as you're coming out the door, you see these gun jeeps that followed the plane in because they didn't want anything to happen as you get in the country. So we do the processing and everything, and as I'm done processing, they said, it'll probably be a day or two and they get you an assignment or anything. So I just get back to where they have the barracks and everything to go to sleep, and somebody wakes me up and says, you got an interview in about 10 minutes. So I get up and I run over to this one place where I had the interview, and it was for Captain Military Assistance Command in Saigon. And the one officer that interviewed me said, yeah, you can come to work for me tomorrow. So then I finished processing, and I went to work for CMAC, which was Captain Military Assistance Command. At that time, CMAC was not, well, it was a unit on paper, but not a unit or anything as far as the one star I have, and this is Captain Military Assistance Command. That's their emblem. We lived in hotels downtown, and we busted work out at MACV Annex, and that was a little different. I mean, that tour, I spent a year there, and we walked around. We went to movies. We did all kinds of stuff in Saigon, and not out in the bush or anything. Well, then I requested an extension, and I was going to go to work as the administrative supervisor for the PX system in Cholon area, which was west of town. And then they decided that I should probably come home, so I came home, and I was restationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And after a couple months working there, I ran into a warrant officer that had just left Washington, D.C., and he had needed new ID cards. I'd worked in personnel management, and he needed new ID cards for his family and stuff. So I went in on a Saturday morning and issued his whole family their ID cards and everything as he was on leave. And I was talking to him and said, I'd really like to go back to Vietnam. And I'd put in 2 requests to transfer back to Vietnam, and they had all been turned down because they were really short of personnel management specialists in the United States. Well, he had just left Washington in an assignment branch in Washington, D.C. And so he said, well, my replacement name is a gentleman named Master Sergeant Snow. He said, let's call him and talk to him. So I called Master Sergeant Snow, and he said, Darryl, I ain't got anything for you right now, but if you just keep calling me, I'll get you something. So I kept calling him, and I called him, after about 2 months, he said, Daryl, I've got an assignment for you back in Vietnam. He said, if you put your application in and hand carry it as far as you can, I'll get you back to Vietnam. So I put it in, and everybody laughed at me because it was my third application, and they'd all been turned down. And all of a sudden, like 2 days later, I get a electric message that I've been accepted for Vietnam. And my boss was a captain, and he said, how did you get this? They've all been turned down. And then he remembered that I'd processed that warrant officer. And he said, Daryl, you asked for a favor, didn't you, from that warrant officer? And I said, I sure did. And he got me back to Vietnam. And I flew into Saigon again, and I thought, oh, I'm going to be back in Saigon. And then they sent me to the Delta, and I got my second tour with the 7th of the 1st Air Cav in the Delta. And being a Native American, they had what they had called Aero Scouts, which was light observation helicopters, and they always wanted me to be on them because they wanted to do a photo op on it as a Native American with the Aero Scouts. But I never did that because those Aero Scouts got shot down a lot, and I wasn't into that kind of assignment that I wanted to be shot down. So the gentleman that was in charge of the Aero Scouts always, every time he'd see me, say, "You ready, Chief?" All Native Americans at that time were always called Chief, and I'd say, "Chief, you ready? You ready?" And I would say, "No, I'm not ready to join the Aero Scouts yet." But my experiences were, for the most part, pretty good. The first time I came home and transferred to Fort Bragg, there wasn't a lot of protest. When I came home the second time and I flew into San Francisco, I had an uncle who lived in Oakland, and he called me when I processed out and he said, they're protesting a lot. When you fly out of the airport in San Francisco, you might not want to wear your military uniform. So when we went to his house, when we got up the next morning, I processed out at like 3 o'clock in the morning. We went to his house. We went shopping about 9 o'clock, and I got civilian clothes. So when I flew home in civilian clothes. I didn't wear a uniform because of all the protests that were going on in the airport at that time on the Vietnam War and everything. And if you have some more questions,
What year was that?
Oh, I was in Vietnam with CMAC right after the TED of '68. CMAC got formed because of the TED of '68, because they realized after the TED of '68 there was no central command for the defense of Saigon. So they formed the Capital Military Assistance Command for the Army side of the house to direct everything, and the military side of the house on the Vietnamese was Capital Military District. And it was their headquarters for Capital Military District in Vietnam was Camp Le Van Duet. And eventually we all grouped up there. And we were a division headquarters without any troops. So we had a 2-star general and a 1-star general and all the general staff. All our combat troops were the 99th Infantry and the 3rd of the 2nd of the 3rd Airborne Unit out of Fort Bragg. So they each controlled 2 districts, like the West and the South, and the North and the West belonged to each of those 2 brigades. So that was interesting. They each had their own general, and then we had our 2 generals, and they would fly around and visit with their gentlemen. And there's an interesting fact that the 3rd of the 82nd Airborne, their commander was named Robinson, and the 199th brigade commander's name was Robinson. So they used to get really confused because the generals would say, "Well, I saw General Robinson," and you had to figure out which general he was talking about. So you usually called his chief of staff and say, "Where'd he fly yesterday?" Because he'd say, "I saw some troop down on the deal, and I awarded him a medal or something." And I was working in personal actions at the time, so I'd have to run all these things down. And it used to be really interesting where you'd say, "Where did he fly last night, and who did he talk to?" So, but that was part of my experience, and for the most part, it was pretty good. So
that's wonderful.
And I was glad I'd served those 2 tours, and and it was pretty interesting the fact that the recruiter had said, "I've got people going to Canada that are trying to get out of it, and here you want to go to Vietnam," and I did.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Wolf Point, Montana, in northeastern Montana. So, and that's where I came back in the wintertime, and it was cold and everything. And I had spent 18 months in Korea, and that's an interesting story. When I was in Korea, I was in Fort Bragg twice, and I worked for the Inspector General's office at Fort Bragg, and they were calling for volunteers for the 2nd Infantry Division. as a mascot and as a Native American. My boss had submitted me. He was a colonel, and he submitted my application, and I got accepted. So I went on special assignment to Korea as the mascot for the 2nd Infantry Division, because they had a Native American who they dressed in Native regalia, and he performed at all their ceremonies and everything. And so I was going for that assignment. So when I got to Korea, when we were in processing, one officer came and talked to me, and he said, "Chief, I've got good news and I've got bad news." He said, "The bad news is the other chief wants to stay another 6 months." He said, "The good news is anywhere you want to go, I'll send you." So I said, "Well, where would you go if you were assigned to Korea?" He said, "If I was assigned here, I'd go to Busan, which is in as far south as you could go in the Delta." So I said, "Send me to Busan," and I loved it in Busan. It was pretty nice, and I had 3 friends that I went through basic and AIT and our assignments together that went to Korea, and they went to the DMZ. And I went up and visited them a couple times, and it was not really good up at the DMZ. So I was really glad that I got a chance to be stationed in as far south as I could go. And interesting enough, I'd gone to an 8th Army football game where 8th Army played the 2nd Infantry Division in football. And the Native American rode around the stadium on a really nice horse and everything, but they would throw things at him from the other bleachers, and so I was pretty glad after a while that I did get that assignment. That was pretty funny that the Native American, although it would have been interesting.
Yeah.
As the Native American for the Indian head, they called them the Indian head of the 2nd Infantry Division because that's what they are.
Yeah.
And that would have been an interesting assignment. So that's about all I have, unless you have some more questions.
That's great, Daryl.